I don't think I've been more somber inside about talking about this topic, which I've done for 30 years in my professional life, and now come before this audience in these settings at this time to do that. So my name is Shelley Collins, one of the core leaders here in London Network Church. And today, Alex has asked me to talk about race and culture. And I think it's an opportunity for us to define, clarify, explore these words. What do we mean when we talk about race and racism in the context, especially of what's been happening over the last 2 weeks? It's a daunting challenge, and I'm hoping I will be able to do justice to the conversation, which in fact will get covered later. But I want to start, if you like, quite clinically in a specific place. I'm talking here in the UK, so I want to look at how does UK law define race? Because there's lots of different definitions of race, and the word is used in all sorts of contexts, and there's a bit of confusion. So I want to just talk a bit of clarity. So for example, if you look at the legal definition under what was then the Race Relations Act, which is now the Single Equality Act, it will say that race is your color, your race, your ethnic or national origin, and also your religion. So for example, there are two religions who are also defined as races: the Jewish race and the Sikhs are defined as a race as well as a religion. And so sometimes we are confused. We've been struggling with our relationships, with our friends, with our families, with our colleagues, even within ourselves. We've been dealing with guilt, anger, disappointment, the years of denial or the years of not seeing, the silence of others, causing us to begin to redefine our world. And just as we're coming, hopefully, at the end of COVID, and so there's some questions that we're left with. Who am I? How do I define myself? How do others define me? When they look at me, what do they see? What are the words they use? And then I looked to God and I said, God, what is happening? What do we do now? And how do we move forward? So I want to take us to that place of the very beginning, because there's what's going on in the world, there's what's going on, if you like, from God's perspective, and I sit in the middle, and I'm trying to walk that road carefully and accurately. And so I thought I'd start where God started. And so at the very beginning, Genesis 1:26 says, "Then God said, let us make man in our own image, in our likeness." And then he says, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. So God created us. And so the question is, what does he want from us? If you go to Matthew 22:37-40, God's commandments to us as human beings, it says, Jesus replied when asked what the great commandments were, to love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. And this is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love your neighbor as yourself. And so each one of us, consciously or unconsciously, purposefully, will use ourselves as the benchmark of normality. And over the centuries, we've been defined by what region we come from, what language we speak, what religion we are, what skills we have. We talk about people being the warrior race. We've also defined ourselves by comparison with others. What's similar? What's different? Similar to us, different from us. And so we have then this language of the us and the them. We begin to see people as the other. Without God in our daily conversations about this, that gap began to be filled. And the question about where did we come from? How come we're different? How come we look different? How come we have different skills in different ways? And so we came up, mankind came up, Western civilization came up with this thing about the origin of the species. And we came with the concept of evolution. And before I show you two pictures, I really want to make sure that you understand this isn't done to make people guilty. This isn't done to make you ashamed. This isn't done to embarrass. But we need, if we are going to dismantle the systemic, embedded concept of race, which leads to racism, we need to see it in its purest form. So I want to show you the first definition we have as a human being. The concept of evolution says that we are human beings, but science defines human being as a culture-bearing primate classified in the genus Homo, especially species Homo sapiens. Human beings are anatomically similar and related to the great apes, but are distinguished by a more highly developed brain and a resultant capacity for articulate speech and the abstract reasoning. Now, I have a problem with that, because if just before I read it said that God created us in his image, is that what we're saying God looks like? Is that our definition of God? Because God said he made us in his image, but it looks as if we're making God in ours, and that can't be it. So we actually have to find a definition between that definition of a human being and who they are. We are the people that made the policy and designed the system. And so they came up with a theory called the theory of the evolution of man. And the next slide will show you what that theory says. It says that if we are just at one end, slightly removed from the apes, then things must evolve and change over time so that we actually come to the perfect specimen now of humanity. And that started actually by Europeans going out into the world and discovering plants and animals. In fact, the whole concept of gene pools in the genus was started by a man called Linnaeus, a Swedish botanist. And he looked at plants and animals and he said, well, things seem similar and they have common traits. So a lion and a tiger and a leopard are all cats. And so they come from a certain gene pool and they have a certain root. And that was plants and animals. And then Charles Darwin wrote a book called The Origin of the Species, looking at plants and animals. And everyone accuses him of applying it to human beings, but at first he didn't. It was his cousin, Francis Galton, who then said, if it applies to plants and animals, if things can evolve and change according to the environment in, then actually, surely the hierarchy of humanity must be the same. And so eugenics began to study, he began to study and create the science of eugenics, which is we need to define what makes one group superior and what makes one group inferior, and can we breed in superiority and can we breed out inferiority across the human species? That is the foundation of what we're built on. And so many scientists over time began to research, some people said 15 races, some said 20. But there is a definition that was started which said, let us define ourselves and others. And so it was based on some obvious things, physical characteristics, the color of your skin, the color of your eyes, the shape of your eyes, where you came from in the world. And, you know, I often say about Europeans that they applied the golden rule, which is he who had the gold makes the rule. I remember having someone in a course said to me one day, Shelley, you know that racism is something created by Black people to make white people feel guilty. And I went, are you out of your mind? Do you think that I would create a system of oppression which puts myself at the bottom of it so you can deny me? That doesn't make sense. And so I want to just outline, I wish I had lots of time, is to go back historically of where we are now defined as races linked to physical characteristics. And so they said that there are 4 major human species and races: Caucasians, Caucasoids. Why? That word Caucasus comes from where they thought the white-skinned people originated from, of the Caucasus Mountains of Russia. They have white skin, they have blonde hair, they have blue eyes, they're sort of 6 foot tall. You have the Nordic races. You then look to the east of the globe and you see the Far East, the people referred in history as the Mongol hordes, the Mongol race. They have yellow skin, they have straight black hair, they have what's known as the epicantic fold of the eye. And so they are labeled as the Mongols, and that includes what we would call the Chinese people, the Japanese people, and actually some people across the continents. And then we get to this group of people called the Negroids or Negroes, so called because the Spanish and the Portuguese word for black was negra. And this is written in the 16th and 17th century. And if you look at the physical definition, which is interesting, given the photo that I showed you earlier of where they think humanity came from, the Oxford Dictionary definition of as a Negro is a black skin, flat nose, woolly hair, thick-lipped member of the human race. Well, that's the species. And the Australoids are those people that, if you like, in the Southern Hemisphere, the Aborigines, the Maoris, there's a whole mixture of people. Now, as a scientific definition, you could go with that. You go, yeah, those people, those things make sense. But then comes the whole idea of evolution. And again, Europeans created and used the golden rule. And he who has the gold makes the rule. And so they say this thing must be an evolutionary tree. Caucasians on the top, Mongols at the bottom, and it's debatable about those other 2 groups. And so science defined Negroids and Australoids as not being human. And one of the things, if you listen to the whole outcry around George Floyd and the treatment of Black people in America, embedded in the American Constitution was that Black people were not defined as fully human. It took the American government until 1960 to declare Black people to be 100% human and therefore legally had a right to be educated. Now in Britain, we could sit here and go, oh, we didn't do that. But the challenge is, and the acceptance we have to have, is Francis Galton, who designed the concept of eugenics, is British, exported to America, France, Spain, Portugal, great scientists around the world. And this concept became fact. And that, at that point for me, I think, well, what is that? Where did that come from? Okay, why those species came? And God took me back to the Bible and reminded me of the scattering of the people at the Tower of Babel, because they were getting too smart and building and wanting to be like God. And he said, I will scatter them across different languages, different cultures, traditions and customs. So there's a scattering of people. God created all of humanity and it got scattered. And the challenge for us is, how has that worked out? How has that been exposed? We can talk about British colonialism, we can talk about French colonialism, and then that thing about othering us. If I walk into a culture where in my culture we wear clothes and we walk into that culture and they're naked, if I walk into a culture where I eat with a knife and fork and a spoon, but they eat with their hands, I begin to measure whether or not they are like me, whether they are civilized, whether or not they are in any way, form, or chance intelligent. Are they cultured? And so part of the challenge we have is through colonialism, through those comparisons, we have some experiences of people who are made to feel less than. I grew up in Barbados in the West Indies. People often say Barbados is more British than the British. And in some ways that's true. But one of the things in just researching even for this is to discover that the founding, the honing of the pattern of how you manage slaves in the slave trade was perfected in Barbados through the plantation system, then taken to North America. And so there are things in the way we are that actually, intentionally or unintentionally, purposefully or not purposefully, we pick up. And so before we define this thing of racism, we accept that there's a concept of race, and any ism is a belief system. So racism is the belief in the inherent superiority of one race over the other, and that race is used as the benchmark of normality, of what's right, what's good. So I remember, if a child wants to, and that conversation, by the way, now sits on both sides of the conversation. So if you're a Black parent and your child wants to play the violin, some Black people will accuse you of being a Bounty Bar or an Oreo cookie, and you're aspiring to be white. You go, what? I just like playing music. People make assumptions about me. When I first came to Britain as a nurse, 18 years old, I left Barbados and went into the nursing profession. And there was a lot of cultural learning I had to do about customs and tradition, because I thought I was British, thoroughly so. And so people would say to me, oh, you can drop around any time. And I would, because in Barbados you would. And then they would say, oh, but you didn't tell me you were coming. So I got a bit confused. And when I arrived, they might have had a piece of Beethoven or Bach in the background playing. And as I arrived, they would rush and take it off and put on a piece of Bob Marley to make me feel more comfortable. Really? Here's the news. My grandmother would not even have let me play Bob Marley in Barbados, because that was low-class people's music. Here, the internalization of the concept of superiority, inferiority, civilized or uncivilized. And so I want to just show you, again, this thing that is happening around us. It's like, well, how do we get from race and racism to how we treat people? And so I want to introduce you to something called Allport Scale of Acting Out Prejudice. It was created by a man called Gordon Allport, who had looked at what had happened to the Jews in the Holocaust, what was happening to America, that at the point where in the late 50s, where people would bring their picnic baskets and kids and watch Black people being lynched. And he said, what has happened to the psyche of humanity where something that atrocious can be seen as normal? And he came up with a scale which says, if you look, what's the lowest form of discrimination we can express? What's the worst thing we do? It's the words we use. It's what we say. It's how we talk about them. So when I worked with the police service, they would tell me that all gypsies are thieving, lying bastards. You go, what, all of them? They said, yes, the ones you've met, the ones you haven't met. And so that phrase he called anti-locution, bad mouthing, derogatory comments, jokes, nicknames, put downs. And the challenge for each one of us, I don't know about you, but I can't even put my hand up and say I've never done that. I might not have done it on race, but if I see a woman, for example, wearing a bright red lipstick, I can hear my grandmother's voice in my head going, tart. We inherit these things. There's the us and the them. But the concept says, if we can say things about them, if we can make them less than us, if we can dehumanize them, if we can call them the N-word, if we can call them a monkey, if we can make monkey noises at Black people, if we can make other noises at other people, then it gives us a permission and a right to then distance ourselves from them. And so we go into this thing of avoidance. 1970 Britain, I came in Plumstead and Woolwich to signs that said no dogs, no Blacks, no Irish. No, no, we don't have anything against you, but actually we just don't live in our houses, don't come in our streets. And when that is in place, then the act of treating less favorably, because the word discrimination has a negative concept. And I think it's really important that we recognize the word discriminate actually means to select, to choose. So if you go back 30, 40 years ago, you would say someone had a discriminating taste in music or fine wines or cheese. Now, in the context of where we're at, if you say you're a discriminating person, people say, on what issue? And get out your checkbook. And so discrimination is treating people less favorably, either by acts of commission, what we do, or by acts of omission, what we do not do. And so you see from there that some people will then express their dislike by physical attack. You know, go back again to the phraseology I heard when I'm doing race relations with the police from 1987. People went out packy bashing, people went out queer bashing, people do all sorts of things to people because of who they are. They put dog excrement through your letterbox, they put burning paper through your letterbox because they want to get rid of you. And then we all know, in terms of the Jews, or we look at Rwanda, that extermination, that genocide, that people hate you so much, they will actually kill you. And that makes up Allport Scale. And the challenge for us is, we often will sit at the bottom of the scale and say, well, just because I tell a Black joke or whatever joke, doesn't mean I want these people killed. But actually, if you look at it, all that is required for evil to succeed is for good people to do nothing. If you don't challenge the racist joke, if you don't challenge the inappropriate behavior, if you sign the petition at the school gate so that the gypsies don't have to come to our schools, if you actually choose, intentionally or unintentionally, that you'd prefer to be served by other people, you would prefer to not have those things around. We discriminate, we select. And the question is not whether or not we discriminate, it's about, is it lawful or is it unlawful? Is it just or is it unjust? And when we have laws in our country that make it permissible to discriminate on the basis of race, on the basis of gender, on the basis of orientation, on the basis of religion, on the basis of disability. And in fact, one of the challenging things when you look at this concept of race, and people think it only applies to Black people and eugenics only applied to Black people, the huge eugenics movement in America was actually that thing about racial purity, that you are fit, that you are perfect. There was a whole thing in America of, we have to get rid of the feeble-minded, we have to get rid of those who are not fit, we have to get rid of those children who have disabilities. And the largest eugenics movement actually had mass sterilization in America as part of its policies up until 1960s and 70s. Those who were considered subhuman were useful fodder for experiments. The Tuskegee experiment, where we take Black workers, God help us, and we inject syphilis into them. And because they're not 100% human, they're told actually that they're getting some health care, but actually what they got injected with was syphilis. And then even when penicillin was invented in 1947, this thing started in 1937, they refused to apply the cure because actually they had the opportunity to watch the entire course of how syphilis ran. And actually it was President Bill Clinton in 1967 who apologized, 1997, who apologized for the Tuskegee experiments. And before you say, we wouldn't do that, we do that with all sorts of things. I have to call to mind that we other people, even in the current state, before COVID, You know, people voted and there was angst about those migrants and foreigners. The challenge for me from 1970 to now, we've repeated that same conversation over and over again. We haven't changed the system, we've just changed the victim of that we've talking about. First it was West Indians, then it was the Irish. I remember moving into where I lived in Park Road, and there was an elderly Irish gentleman that lived next door, and I remember him saying to me, he said, you know, he said, it's good to meet you. He said, but you people saved our butts, because prior to you, it was us, the Irish. And so we've said it about the Irish, we've said it about Black people, we've said it about Asians, we've said it about whatever. And the recent things, it was the Eastern Europeans, these people who come and take, they are coming to take our jobs and take our houses and whatever, and they shouldn't be here. Let me give you a hint. The Minister for Health who came to Barbados and actively recruited Black people was one Mr. Enoch Powell. But nobody sat in the middle of Delhi and Bombay and plotted to take over Oldham. We invited them because they were part of our colonies. Nobody sat in the middle of Africa and decided to do those things. And so we have to live with the complexity of this race. And I want to leave it there because I wanted to give you the scientific definitions and begin to plant some seeds so you can open your eyes and see. Because that racial hierarchy consciously defines everything. So I work with companies, they speak to me on the phone, I arrive at their office to meet them. I say, Mrs. Collins is here, and I have watched the person that the receptionist told Mrs. Collins is here come out, walk past me, go to the reception and say, I thought you say Mrs. Collins was here. You see, my name Collins tells you nothing about my color. And then she says to me, but you didn't sound, and I'm thinking you're digging a deep hole. I didn't sound what? Black? How are you meant to sound when you're Black? How you're meant to sound? And so people often say, generals say to me things like, Shelley, you know, I'm so comfortable with you, I don't even notice that you're Black. And I think, I pause for a moment, look squarely in the eye, waiting, and they can sense the discomfort, and then they back it up with a compliment. Oh, no, 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 what I mean is, if they were all like you, we wouldn't have any problems. And I'll leave that with you. What do we do with others? What do we do with people? What do we do with others? Who do we see as civilized or uncivilized? When we see people do things differently to us, when we see colors that are a bit loud for us, do we see it as just different? Or do we see it as, oh my God, that's a bit over the top? When some Asians move into Southall and people go, oh, I would never live in Southall. Why? Have you seen their culture? Have you seen their grace? Have you seen their beauty? The fact that they wear saris? Here's the news for you. When you convert the Asians to Christianity, they still wear saris because it's part of the culture. It's not part of being a Christian. And so when we export Christianity, we need to make sure we export the word of God, package it as God packaged it, not packaged in Western concepts of what being a Christian is. And that's hard for me to say. But I feel now God says it's necessary to say. Because God created us in his image. But we often have created God in ours. And what's even sad within the Christian faith is not just the image, but then you have to go and split it all down into different denominations. Well, growing up in the Caribbean, I can tell you, I've done the Baptist bit, the Methodist bit, the Moravian bit, the Pentecostal bit. But there was one thing that was interesting. And I say this graciously, because my brother who's a Rastafarian didn't say it graciously. In his awakening, he said, I find this amazing because all the images of Jesus look like Robert Powell. And you have Black people sitting in a church praying to a God to wash them and make them whiter than snow, to a God who looks nothing like them. And that's quite a brutal thing to say. I'm not saying we now have to rush around and change all the imagery, but actually to recognize that when I accept Jesus as my Savior, he says that the Holy Spirit, the third part of the Trinity, comes to reside in me, and he comes to reside in you. And therefore, when I see you and when you see me, if we call ourselves Christians, it is the God in me that has to reach out to the God in you and find reconciliation. We go past, because remember, God says, God does not judge by the outward appearance. He judges by the heart. And so culture, that's race, and culture are those things. You know, there are three definitions that I just want to briefly touch on. That culture can be referred to as special intellectual or artistic endeavors or products, which today we might call high culture. High culture. A small group. So we talk about the culture, the elite, you know, that there's this sense of refinement. The second definition talks about a complex whole, which includes knowledge, belief, arts, morals, laws, and capabilities, which makes a man as part of a member of society. So we talk about the African Caribbean culture, the Nigerian culture, the Scottish culture, the Welsh culture, the Irish culture. And then there's this concept of culture as a collective programming of the mind, which distinguishes the members of one group or people from another. And again, this othering. And so we become this thing of us and them. So some questions I want to ask. What makes us us? What defines us as we? Who is our brother? How do we select? What are the spoken and unspoken expectations, rules, customs, or traditions that make others our brothers and our sisters? What happens when they don't meet our criteria? And I think we can see that out in the world. And so again, I have to go back and see, what does God command us about how we treat others? In 1 John 4, 19 to 21, it says, whoever claims to love God and yet hates a brother or a sister is a liar. For whoever does not love their brother or sister who they have seen cannot love God whom they have not seen. And he has given us this command. Anyone who loves God must also love their brother or sister. And so you see that the heart of the matter is the matter of the heart. We walk around like icebergs. On the top of the iceberg is what I say and what I do and how I act. But sitting beneath that iceberg is years of experiences, positive ones, negative ones, or attitudes, or prejudices, or beliefs, or values, or socializations. And every now and then, the icebergs sometimes collide. And sometimes they don't collide on the surface. They collide under the water. I don't know if you've had that experience, but I've had it, where you meet someone and it's like you've known them all your life, and so they're easy to embrace as a brother and they're a friend. But then there are other people that you meet and you just don't know why, but you know that you know that you know that you don't like them. And try as you might, if you're not careful, they become what we call a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you think they're lazy, they'll be lazy. If you think they're whatever, they'll be whatever. And as a leader and as a manager, as a human being, for your colleagues, if you are not careful, people become the self-fulfilling prophecy that they are. I notice as a manager, I can have two people do exactly the same thing or make exactly the same mistake. And if the person I like, in my head, I make an adjustment and I say, oh, they're just having a bad day. If it's the person I don't like, then I think, see, I could have told you they were going to do that. I could have told you there were an accident waiting for somewhere to happen. And that's how subtle, and that's how easy, and that's how quick it is to judge people. That's at an individual level. And so there's a whole question at the moment of, well, how do we change? How do we change the systems? How do we change the structures? How do we get rid of this thing? And again, I don't have time, but I want to just show you, when we talk about systems, let us be precise. Within our systems, within our institutions, within our organizations, within our society, there are power structures. There are spoken and written norms and values. There are organization support structures that help organizations be who they are and what they are. There is our peer support, and then there's the climate. And in the middle of all that, there are the behavioral choices that we make. And so we didn't get into this mess overnight. We're not going to get out of this mess overnight. There's a couple of quotes I wanted to put here that is important to help us guide through this. I had the privilege of working with Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and he says, there comes a time when we have to stop pulling bodies out of the water downstream. And then we need to go upstream and find out why they're falling in. And one of the major statements that have been bandied around, especially on race or culture, people say, I don't see race. You see, the problem is, if you don't see race, which defines me, then you will not see the racism that affects me. Because if you don't believe in the concept of race, then what happens to me is just a figment of my imagination and something that I need to get over. So we need to come back to, as Christians, of people who claim the name of God or true spiritual identity. 1 Corinthians 15:49 says, and just as we have been born in the image of the earthly man, so shall we bear the image of the heavenly man. And so we begin to realize that, yes, God had a plan. God has something he did, but we seem to have forgotten in all of this that there's an enemy, there's Satan with his thing to wreak havoc of what God wanted to do. And so in Ephesians 6:12, it says, for our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world. And I think that's important, that there are things going on behind the scenes. You know, and I want to acknowledge my son Luke, who's been talking about some stuff going on behind the scenes. And what's interesting for me is what he is saying is now completely aligning with the prophetic words coming from the prophets. And so we must not be naive about what's going on within our rulers, against the authorities and the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. And so we need to be careful, because even those rulers, those authorities, and the powers, the people that are there, they're not bad people, but the enemy actually are using them to do his work. And so part of our challenge is to have grace, because after we freed ourselves, we have to free those people who've been caught up, and we have to have the grace to forgive. We have to have the grace to look past it. We have to have the grace to smile, because I know when I look in that eye, even for all that you've done, if the Jesus in me can unlock the Jesus in you, then there will be a reconciliation, and there will be the heart to forgive. So the choice for us, the church, are we willing to examine what we're doing, how we really are. Are we willing to listen? Are we going to be the church? We've been asking the Lord for revival. And Cara, at this point, I want to say, I couldn't believe what you said. Because this is what God revealed to me at 3 o'clock this morning, between 3 o'clock yesterday afternoon and 3 o'clock early this morning. He says we've been asking for revival. And we often say, Lord, start with me. The Lord knows that the heart of the matter is the matter of the heart, because he says, out of the heart, the mouth speaks. So we need to discover what's inside us. All of us. We need to confess it. We need to seek forgiveness. We need to seek reparation. We need to do reconciliation. God is doing a deep work. There's a deep healing taking place. We are all a work in progress. And I want to confirm what Cara said. God said from Pentecost, when the Spirit was poured out, you know, George Floyd was killed on the Monday leading up to Pentecost. And it says his death is that pointy arrow that pierced our hearts. Is the turning the world upside down. The outpouring of the Spirit is that outpouring of righteous anger. There's a commitment to take action. People have felt they need to do something. And before the church takes all the credit, it says in Joel, God says, in the latter days, I will pour my Spirit out on all men. It's not just the people in the church. There are people outside of the church who've been having visions, who've been having dreams. There's a young woman that someone told me about who get these downloads, and she shared it with her parents, and they thought she was crazy, and they had her sectioned and put in a mental institution. We need to wake up, church. God is not sitting in our buildings. He says he will pour it on all people. The revival has started. The harvest is ripe. The reapers are few. We need to get out of our churches and actually be the answer and be the voice and be the healing solution. There's a global unity. Look, George Floyd died in America, and there are people protesting in Australia, in Sweden, in Norway. God is calling his people back to unity. He is rebuilding his people. Babel is being reunited. Think about the outpouring of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost. And it says there were people from every nation. And yet, when the disciples began to speak, everyone understood, because the disciples spoke, and yet every nation understood it in their language. We need to go and help people understand. We have a personal choice in this Kairos moment. That personal choice is not about taking sides. And again, God took me to Joshua 5, 13 to 15, when Joshua was in the middle of battle. And it says that when Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. And Joshua went up to him and said, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" "Neither," he replied, "but as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come." And then Joshua fell face down in the ground in reverence and asked, "What message does my Lord have for his servant?" And the commander of the Lord's army says, "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." And this is holy ground. There's some conscious work required. When we see another person of another race, of another religion, of another culture, of another ethnicity, we have the opportunity for them to meet the Jesus in us. When I look at them, no matter what they've done, what part they've played, I choose to see brothers and sisters, to see the Jesus in them. This takes constant conscious work. It takes renewing of our mind. And so God reminds us in Romans 12:2, do not be conformed to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve God's will, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. So this is not easy. I've put a diagram up there, and I want Josh to push up, because the path of change. If you do anything in organizational change or life change, the first part, when something dramatic and critical happens, is that there's denial. And then there's fear. And then there's resistance, because we want to have it the way we were. Listen, in COVID, people want to go back to normal. There is no going back to new normal. And then there's anger. And then there's despair. But I want us to actively make a choice to begin the exploration of moving forward. Make a commitment, because once we make that commitment, we will make it. So I want to summarize our calling based on the word of God. We are not useless. We are not helpless. If we have God inside us, we need to hear our calling. He says, arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord rises upon you. See, darkness covers the earth, and thick darkness is over the peoples. But the Lord rises upon you and me, and his glory appears over us. Nations will come to our light, and the kings of brightness to our dawn. That's our calling. And what is our final mandate? When we feel weak, when we feel we don't know what to do, Isaiah 61 tells us. This is the thing we need to speak over ourselves every minute of every day. The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted and to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn, and to provide for those who grieve in Zion, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. They will be called oaks of righteousness, a planting of the Lord for the display of his splendor. Thank you for allowing me to share what the Lord gave me to share. And I walk this road with each one of you. And I know it's not easy. Thank you. And hand back to Alex. Thank you.